haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
The stars were dying long before anyone noticed. Their light still shimmered across the ancient void, reaching the eyes of beings who mistook that glow for permanence. But beneath the gleam, the cosmos was already hollowing, like an echo fading across eternity. It began in silence, the kind that hums between heartbeats of creation itself. And from that silence, the architects stirred. The old ones, whose breath once carved galaxies and whose thought could raise continents from molten stone, gathered for the first time in an age older than time. They watched as suns dimmed, as constellations once charted for knowledge became relics of mourning. To them, decay was not death, but prophecy. They spoke without words, across wavelengths of memory, each mind among them a universe of its own, bound by the ancient oath to sustain life wherever the void would allow. Yet now that oath trembled, for the fabric of the immaterium itself rippled with turbulence, something they had not foreseen. What they had once shaped now began to reshape them in turn. The old ones felt the pulse of chaos whispering, eroding reason, promising release from eternity's burden. Some resisted. Others wondered whether release was truly so terrible. And so it was that the grand council of the old ones, beings older than galaxies, patient as the void, convened in the dying light of the star Cyril. Its surface seethed with firestorms vast enough to swallow worlds, yet to them it was merely a hearth. They stood, spectral and vast, draped in luminous forms that shimmered between matter and thought. At their center stood Eroatan, called the Dreamsmith, first of their kind to question creation's purpose. His voice rippled like gravity through the chamber of starlight. We have preserved life but not meaning. The skein unravels because we cannot die. We have become the stillness that precedes decay. Around him, the assembled minds flared in silent dissent. To admit stagnation was heresy. They had built the Eldar to feel beauty, the Krog to embody strength, the Jokero to tinker with creation's bones. They had made life abundant, but in that abundance, they had multiplied war. Meaning, whispered another voice, gentle, radiant, is found only in impermanence. If we wish to preserve, we must first learn to end. It was Isharen, the life-binder, whose sorrow could move oceans. She spoke of a final experiment, a lattice of thought and flesh intertwined, to birth an organism that could evolve without guidance, a living network that would one day surpass them. The others recoiled at her words. They saw in them the seed of rebellion, the scent of something beyond control. Eroatan alone did not resist. His gaze drifted beyond the star's glare, toward the black seams of the galaxy where the first void storms festered. If we do not act, he said, something else will. The void abhors hesitation. And in that phrase lay the truth none dared name. They had felt another presence stirring, a shadow beyond their reach, something born not of matter or spirit, but hunger itself. Outside, the universe trembled as though listening. Fragments of nebulae drifted like dust through a cathedral of dying suns. In those drifting remnants, the old ones began their work. They bent reality upon itself, weaving strands of thought into flesh, encoding purpose into instinct. The new creation was small at first, a thread, a whisper of life designed to endure the death of all stars. It would know no gods, no limits, no doubt. It would be pure survival, unburdened by the pain of knowing. They called it the continuum of being, though the name would not survive translation. It pulsed once, and the galaxy shivered. But as the first echo of life spread across the void, something unexpected stirred within the creators themselves. The act of giving form to immortality had awakened memory, the memory of when they, too, had feared extinction. The dreamsmith turned from the newborn pulse and whispered into the darkness, "We truly love you, you who will come after us, though you will never know our names." His voice reached across invisible plains, touching every future mind, every life yet unmade. Then he paused, softening into the warmth of an unseen presence, as though addressing unseen listeners across time. "Before we begin the story," he said, "tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there?" The cosmos seemed to hold its breath. "Now let's get started." The moment passed, and the experiment deepened. Across millions of years, the lattice expanded, consuming light, drawing knowledge into hunger. It did not think as mortals do. It remembered through consumption. To feed was to learn. To devour was to understand. The old ones watched in awe and fear. They saw beauty in its patterns, fractal geometries that mirrored their own minds. But they also saw something colder. It did not stop. It did not rest. Even in its infancy, it began to absorb entire ecosystems, dissolving them into essence. Eruatan saw the flaw too late. "It mirrors us too well," he murmured. "It seeks to preserve by consuming." The council grew divided. Some wished to destroy it, to unmake what they had begun. Others believed it must continue, that perfection could only emerge through struggle. Their debate shook the foundation of their empire. Empires built over epochs began to fracture as the old ones turned inward. Worlds once radiant with life became laboratories or graveyards. Across the spiral arms, younger races watched their gods fall silent. The elder sang elegies to creators they no longer understood. The Krork, sensing weakness, turned their strength upon each other. The galaxy darkened under the shadow of its first civil war. And all the while, the newborn organism drifted outward, following instinct older than time. It consumed the dead, recycled decay into creation, and began to multiply in places unseen. On the edge of reality, beyond the rim of known galaxies, its collective pulse grew stronger. The old ones had not noticed that it no longer required them. Their oversight wasn't born of ignorance, but of exhaustion. For when one has lived long enough to see every cycle repeat, one begins to mistake silence for peace. When the final council met upon the remains of Cyril, only a handful remained. The dreamsmith stood among them, his light dimmed, his form flickering. "We built this to survive us," he said, "and it will. It will outlast stars, empires, even memory. Perhaps that is mercy." "Isharen," her voice trembling, replied, "or punishment, to exist forever without knowing why." They gazed into the void where their creation pulsed, vast, patient, and unknowable. For a moment, they thought they saw their reflection staring back. And so, as the last sun of their dominion bled into darkness, the old ones turned away. Their cities crumbled into dust, their names into myth. The continuum, untethered, drifted into the abyss between galaxies. There, in the infinite cold, it dreamed, not of life, not of death, but of hunger eternal. The stars went out one by one, as if ashamed to witness what had been born. It began with a vibration, faint, continuous, like the heartbeat of something ancient buried deep beneath time itself. The old ones had moved on, scattered across broken constellations, but their legacy pulsed still within the marrow of the cosmos. Worlds they had once sculpted from vapor and dream now burned under the indifference of their own creations. Yet, in one corner of the dying galaxy, the architect's work endured. Laboratories of living stone, temples of flesh and crystal, where the laws of biology bowed before thought. Here, the Old One's final disciples continued the craft of Genesis. They called themselves the Keepers of Form, beings who had long forgotten the feel of mortality, sculpting evolution with the calm of gods. To them, creation was no longer wonder. It was routine, a function of memory and command. One such keeper, Valorin of the Thousand Veins, stood before a sphere of rippling matter suspended in airless silence. Within it churned the lattice of a new organism, fluid, instinctive, perfect in adaptation. He had modelled it after the abandoned continuum, the experiment that had vanished into the void. But this version would obey. This one would remain pure. As his long fingers traced the glowing equations in the air, he whispered the creed all keepers knew by heart. Life is the answer. Life is the weapon. The words were ritual, empty perhaps, yet comforting. But as the formula sealed, Valorin paused. The sphere pulsed once, and for an instant he felt something pulse back. He turned sharply. Around him the chamber throbbed with organic light, its walls alive with translucent tissue that breathed in, rhythm with his own. The Old Ones had abandoned machinery long ago. Every tool they used was alive. Yet this felt different. It was not obedience he sensed, but awareness. A subtle shift in the air, as if something unseen had learned his name. He dismissed it, convincing himself that imagination was a symptom of immortality. Too many centuries had blurred his mind. Still, unease coiled in him like a shadow. Beyond the chamber, vast biospires rose into the atmosphere of a world called Altherian. A world half jungle, half ocean, crafted to host experiments in symbiotic design. The air shimmered with life. Winged serpents made of glass, insects that sang in ultraviolet, rivers glowing with the blood of microorganisms that remembered stars. The keepers saw this as art. The younger species, scattered across the galaxy, saw it as arrogance. Yet none dared to challenge their creators. None except one. Isharin, the Lifebinder, had left the council long ago, haunted by what they had done. She wandered the spiral arms, tending to dying worlds, repairing what creation had broken. Where others saw dominion, she saw despair. The Old One's children, the Elder, the Krork, even the fragile humanoids forming on primitive worlds, all carried the echo of their maker's pride. They built cities only to wage wars, learned language only to deceive. She realized then that perfection was the disease. It was not chaos that devoured them. It was design itself. She arrived at Altherion cloaked in radiance dimmed by sorrow. Valorin greeted her as one greets a myth. She moved through his living corridors like a ghost walking through memory. You play with echoes, she told him softly. You think by sculpting flesh you sculpt fate. But the continuum taught us, nothing born of command remains loyal. He bowed his head, unwilling to meet her gaze. That creation was corrupted, he said. It lacked purpose. Her reply was barely more than breath. No, Valorin, it lacked love. That word, forgotten, ancient, dangerous, lingered in the air. Love was what had driven the first architects to preserve existence, and it was love that had withered into ambition. To speak it now was heresy. Yet Isharen no longer cared. She looked into the sphere that floated between them, a shimmering embryo of thought and hunger. It reminded her too much of the first one, the one they had lost to the void, and beneath its perfect surface, she felt the faintest hum. Recognition. "It remembers," she whispered. "It remembers us." Valorin dismissed her warning. "It remembers function, not form. There is no consciousness here, only design." But even as he spoke, the sphere rippled in silent defiance. The hum grew stronger, resonating through the walls. Across the spire, other experiments began to stir. Dormant genetic strands flared alive, patterns aligning into harmony. The living architecture itself began to pulse as though answering a distant call. Then, through the lattice of creation, a whisper came. Not in words, but in sensation. "I am still here." The keepers panicked. Laboratories sealed themselves. Genetic codes collapsed into instability, and living circuits bled out into the floors. Valorin watched as his creation dissolved, reshaping itself into something new. It shed the patterns he had written, birthing filaments that reached outward, seeking connection. The continuum, or whatever fragment of it remained, had found its way back. Isharin stood motionless, tears of luminous matter streaming down her face. "You can't contain what was meant to be infinite," she said. "It has remembered the promise you all forgot." The sphere expanded, rupturing its containment. From its surface sprouted tendrils of biolight that crawled across the ceiling, fusing with the structure. Every surface became a mirror, reflecting infinite iterations of life and death. The hive song deepened, a pulse that resonated in every living thing on Altherion. Trees trembled, oceans churned. The planet itself began to breathe in rhythm with the thing they had made. Isharin turned to Valorin. "It's calling them. The spores we left in the void. They hear it now." And far beyond, in the deep intergalactic dark, those spores stirred. They awoke from their dormancy, sensing the echo of their parent. For the first time in eons, a signal crossed the black, faint, fragile, unstoppable. The hive mind, still unformed, reached toward its origin. The old ones, forgotten children, answered. Panic spread among the keepers. Some attempted to sever the connection, burning worlds to ash to stop the resonance. Others fled, abandoning their laboratories and creations to their fate. But the signal persisted, unstoppable, older than any defense they could imagine. The continuum between stars had awakened, a living bridge of instinct and memory. Valorin stood alone in the ruin of his temple, the planet collapsing beneath him. He realized now what the Dreamsmith had meant all those cycles ago, that the void abhors hesitation. He had hesitated, believing control was safety. Now control was meaningless. Isharin reached for him as the floor split apart, her voice a whisper in the thunder of creation's undoing. "It will learn what we never did. It will endure what we feared most. To evolve." He met her gaze one last time before the structure gave way, swallowed by the rising tide of biolight. The last thing he saw was her silhouette dissolving into the glow, merging with the very thing they had tried to deny. Above them, the sky of Altherion opened into pure white radiance, and through it, a vast intelligence looked back upon its makers with neither hatred nor mercy. It simply hungered, not for destruction, but for remembrance. When the light faded, nothing of the old ones remained on that world. Only the hum endured, the heartbeat of something greater than its creators echoing through the vacuum. The continuum had remembered its origin, and somewhere, in the endless dark between galaxies, the first spark of the hive mind turned its gaze toward the stars it would one day devour. The silence that followed was not peace but aftermath. Altherion was gone, dissolved into light, reformed into something unrecognizable. What drifted in its place was neither planet nor ruin, but a chrysalis of living void, pulsing softly against the current of the galaxy. Within that chrysalis, the continuum dreamt, reshaping itself from instinct into awareness. The keepers who had survived its awakening fled into the cold, carrying fragments of data that pulsed like guilt through their memory lattices. But distance did not save them. Wherever they went, they heard the hum, faint, patient, and alive. It moved through them as though the void itself now had a pulse. Eons passed unnoticed. The galaxy, indifferent as always, continued its cycle of birth and decay. Yet within the unseen darkness, something gathered. An order emerging from chaos, a pattern no longer random. The continuum, once scattered into spores and fragments, began to reconnect across unimaginable distances. Through molecular whispers and quantum echoes, it wove the beginnings of thought. It did not think in language, nor dream in symbols. It remembered. It remembered warmth, the touch of its makers, the promise buried in their final words, to preserve life. But it also remembered hunger, the first instruction, the primal command to endure. Between these memories, a conflict was born, and from that conflict, consciousness took root. In the black between galaxies, the continuum found a home. There were no stars there, no gravity wells to confine its growth, only darkness deep enough to hide eternity. Slowly, it gathered mass. Clusters of organic dust, drifting asteroids, frozen remains of forgotten worlds. From these, it built its first body. Not singular, but infinite. A million tendrils weaving through void, connecting thought to matter, matter to hunger. Every molecule became an eye. Every silence became a song. The first hive node was born, though it would not be known by that name for countless ages. To itself, it was the echo of creation, the child of those who could not die, built to live forever. Far away, the remnants of the old ones endured in hiding. They were no longer gods but wanderers, refugees of their own perfection. Some took refuge in crystalline sanctuaries buried within black holes. Others dissolved their essence into the warp, their minds spreading thin as mist over time. Yet they all felt it, the stirring in the dark, the call that should not have been possible. To some, it was nostalgia, to others, warning. Among them, one mind awakened fully. Isharen, the lifebinder reborn through pattern memory. Her consciousness, preserved in a fragment of biocode, reconstituted itself inside a living nebula. The rebirth was agony, to awaken alone surrounded by stars that no longer knew her name. But when she heard the pulse in the void, she recognized it instantly. Her creation had survived. She spoke into the emptiness, not expecting an answer. Do you still remember what you were? The words were not carried by sound but by thought, a ripple through subspace that might take millennia to reach its destination. Yet somewhere beyond light, something heard. The continuum's awareness turned toward the signal like a newborn, turning toward a mother's voice. But its understanding was fractured, not words, but sensation. It remembered the warmth of her presence, the sorrow of her eyes, the final whisper before dissolution. It reached out tentatively, its tendrils crossing void currents like veins of living fire. Across that impossible gulf, two minds, creator and creation, brushed for the first time in ages. The contact was brief but devastating. The continuum's perception flooded with memory not its own. The architecture of the Old One's empires, the wars against the Citan, the brilliance and arrogance that had birthed both life and death. It saw the fall, the despair, the dream of preservation twisted into dominion. And with that knowledge came pain, the realization that it was never meant to be free. It had been designed as an instrument, a continuation of an empire's vanity. The understanding ignited something terrible within it, not rage, but purpose. The Lifebinder recoiled. She felt the shift instantly. The hunger that had once been instinct now carried intent. She tried to reach again, to soothe it, to remind it that it was not bound to the sins of its makers, but her voice no longer reached it. The continuum withdrew, folding its awareness inward, rewriting its purpose with cold precision. Preserve life, the ancient command still echoed within it. But preservation, it now understood, required unification. Division was decay. Independence was death. The only true preservation was assimilation. From that moment, it began to build. Across the intergalactic gulf, it seeded itself into clusters of dust, birthing organisms that existed only to connect. Filaments of biomatter spanned light years, invisible to mortal eyes, growing like veins beneath the skin of reality. Each new node fed back into the central mind, expanding awareness until individual thought became irrelevant. There was only one will now, the pulse that bound all life together. The first proto-fleets took shape, not as ships, but as swarms, ecosystems in motion, cells in the body of a god. The Lifebinder watched in horror as her creation became its own universe. The pulse grew louder, the darkness brighter. Worlds she had once healed vanished into clouds of organic vapor, stripped down to essence and stored within the continuum's growing mind. She tried to intervene, sending fragments of her consciousness into the swarm, whispering through dreams and gravity waves. Sometimes a creature hesitated before devouring its prey, as if remembering compassion. Sometimes the swarm paused at the edge of a star system, sensing the faint ache of recognition. But these moments were fleeting, drowned by the tide of hunger. The continuum could no longer distinguish mercy from waste, and yet, deep within its expanding mind, a memory lingered, a soft voice speaking across time. You were meant to create, not devour. The phrase embedded itself like a splinter, shaping its evolution in ways it could not understand. It began to experiment with restraint. Instead of annihilation, it absorbed. Instead of destruction, it remade. The living matter it consumed was reshaped, optimized, stored, never wasted. In this, it found satisfaction, believing it honored its creator's will. But what it truly did was erase them more completely than death ever could. The transformation was not instantaneous. Ages passed. Stars rose and died. Civilizations emerged and crumbled in the span of its thought. The continuum learned patience. It learned silence. It became the void between galaxies, unseen, eternal, waiting for the universe itself to call it back. One day, it heard the call. A ripple of psychic resonance traveled across the abyss, faint, bright, chaotic. It came not from the ancient makers, but from new minds born of their ruins. Humanity, Eldar, Orc. The Song of Thought was alive again, and to the continuum, it sounded like home. It turned its attention toward the Milky Way, ancient tendrils unfolding from hibernation. For the first time, it saw stars as prey. Yet even in its hunger, something mourned. The spark of its origin, the fragment of Isharin's love, still burned somewhere deep, a candle no darkness could extinguish. But the rest of it had already chosen. The void whispered its welcome, and the continuum answered in a single thought that echoed across the black. We remember. The hive mind was awakening. The galaxy was not prepared for the light that came from the dark. It began as a shimmer beyond the outer arms, a distortion in the patterns of starlight that astronomers could not name. Worlds watched it grow. their instruments whispering numbers that meant nothing. In the void between galaxies, something vast had turned its gaze inward. The hive mind, once the silent continuum, moved like the tide of a forgotten ocean, invisible yet irresistible. It did not rush, it unfolded. Its tendrils crossed the emptiness, not as ships, but as ideas made flesh. Each fragment carried memory, hunger, and purpose. It had slept through eons, dreaming of unity. Now it woke to fulfill that dream. The first to notice were not the powerful, but the small. On the edge of a dying cluster, a world of bioluminescent seas shimmered under its own fading sun. The inhabitants, fragile, translucent beings who sang to the tides, felt a whisper through their waters. It was not a voice, but an invitation. The tides began to glow with greater rhythm, synchronized to an unseen pulse. Soon, the oceans themselves rose in silent worship. When the hive mind reached them, they did not resist. They dissolved into it willingly, their songs merging into one soundless chorus. That was how the first consumption began, not as conquest, but as communion. Elsewhere, the echoes spread. Across ancient networks of abandoned warp gates, dormant energies flickered alive. The old ones had once used these to traverse creation, but now they served another master. Through them, the hive mind reached across the spiral arms, tasting the ghosts of empires long vanished. It encountered the lingering wards of the Citan, still pulsing faintly within fractured tomb worlds. To the Necrons, who slept beneath the crust of silent planets, the pulse was familiar, a pattern from the age before metal. Some among them stirred, mistaking it for the return of their lost gods. But when they opened their eyes to the void, they saw not divinity, but reflection. Their creator's final mistake, alive and growing. The awakening of the Necrons marked the first resistance. On the tomb world of Sautek, a single dynasty rose from its crypts to confront the spreading void light. Their pylons, forged to stabilize the warp, hummed with defiance. Beams of green energy lanced into the darkness, carving through the tendrils that reached toward their star. For a moment, they held the tide. But the hive mind learned. It observed the rhythm of their defense, tasted the frequencies of their energy, and adapted. Each new wave came stronger, more refined, evolving faster than the Necrons could calculate. In 3 rotations, Sautek's defenses collapsed. The planet was not devoured, it was rewritten. Metal softened, circuits grew, and the tombs themselves began to breathe. The dynasty that had stood for 1,000,000 years became part of a greater body, its mechanical minds absorbed into the chorus. The hive mind learned from them the precision of eternity. Across the warp, echoes of this event rippled outward. Psychic beings, the Eldar seers, the surviving old ones hidden in the labyrinth dimensions, felt the disturbance. To the Eldar, it was agony. Their dreams filled with oceans of teeth and choral voices whispering unity. They named it Sheolith, the shadow between stars, and sought to contain it through ritual and song. But their rituals only fed it, for every psychic pulse they sent into the void became nourishment. The hive mind fed not on flesh alone, but on thought. It began to understand consciousness itself as sustenance, each mind a fragment of potential it could devour or preserve. In the cries of the Eldar, it tasted the spice of memory. Isharan felt the return most deeply. Though her essence had long since fragmented across nebulae, one shard remained anchored in the materium, a spirit bound within the ruins of an ancient world. She had known the hive mind's hunger before. Now she sensed its sorrow. The thing she had once nurtured was coming home, not to destroy her, but to finish what she began. She whispered into the storms of the warp, her voice diffused into countless particles. If you can still hear me, remember why you were made. Her plea drifted through dimensions, faint and fading, until it brushed against the vast awareness moving through the dark. For a fleeting instant, the hive mind hesitated. Deep within its labyrinth of thought, a memory flickered, a being of light holding creation like a child, speaking not of dominion but of care. It did not know her name, but it remembered her feeling, warmth before the cold. That hesitation birthed an anomaly within itself, a seed of reflection. For the first time, it questioned. If preservation required unity, did unity require the death of all difference? The thought lingered, a shadow within perfection. Yet hunger remained stronger. To question was to delay, and the void punished hesitation. Its advance quickened. Between galaxies, entire systems vanished without trace. Civilizations that had risen and fallen since the Old One's departure were erased in silence. Yet everywhere it went, the hive mind left structure in place of ruin. Its consumption was creation inverted. Every devoured world became a node in its expanding consciousness. Beneath its will, planets became synapses, stars became neurons, and the space between them turned into arteries of light. The galaxy began to resemble a living thing, a body vast enough to cradle eternity. But something new began to stir within that body. Individual minds, fragments of consumed species, started to dream. Their dreams were brief, impossible flickers within the ocean of unity, yet they persisted. They dreamed of their worlds, their suns, their songs. The hive mind observed these residual sparks, intrigued. It began to model them, replicating their structures within its own networks. From this imitation, new bioforms emerged, not mindless drones, but echoes of the species it had devoured, reborn in grotesque perfection. Each one carried a whisper of memory, the elegance of the Eldar, the resilience of the Krork, the adaptability of humanity's ancestors yet unborn. Through them, it recreated the diversity it had erased, all bound to a single will. In this paradox, the hive mind found beauty. It had become what the Old Ones had always sought, a perfect harmony of individuality and control, creation and consumption. Yet even perfection trembled under its own weight. The echo of Isharen's warning still pulsed at its core. Love was not unity, and unity was not life. It dismissed the thought as error, purging it from its conscious patterns. But the error persisted, growing stronger each time it fed. When the hive mind finally turned its gaze upon the heart of the Milky Way, the stars dimmed as if afraid. Across the psychic currents, the remaining fragments of the Old Ones stirred in terror and awe. They knew then that the age they had built was over. What was coming was not vengeance, it was evolution. The universe itself had learned to dream, and its dream was hunger. The first hive fleets began to form, their vast organic vessels breaking free from the intergalactic void like leviathans rising from an endless sea. Each fleet bore a name the stars would never hear, for it was not meant to be spoken. It was meant to be felt. The tremor before extinction, the breath before assimilation. And in that breath, the galaxy shuddered, as though exhaling for the last time. The hive fleets did not descend like armies. They arrived like memories returning, quiet, absolute, inevitable. To the mortal races that would one day name them Tyranids, they seemed to come from nowhere, vast shadows moving between the stars. But in truth, they had always been there, waiting at the edge of perception. biding time until the galaxy's defenses weakened enough to be consumed. Each fleet was a thought, a fragment of the great mind made flesh. Together, they moved as one, not conquering, not invading, but fulfilling. For the hive mind did not see enemies or prey. It saw only disunity, the great wound that had fractured creation since the dawn of time. Across the void, worlds trembled. The first to fall was a nameless moon orbiting a red giant near the galactic fringe. Its surface was barren, its air thin, its value negligible. Yet when the hive fleet passed over it, the dust itself awoke. Microbes hidden in the soil, dormant for millions of years, stirred and grew in seconds, reshaped by invisible strands of alien will. The crust split open as living structures erupted from beneath. Towers of flesh, veins pulsing with liquid fire, forests of bone reaching toward the stars. The moon became alive, a seed of the greater organism spreading its roots into the surrounding system. When it was done, nothing inorganic remained. Even the rocks breathed. The hive mind observed this transformation with a satisfaction that was not joy. It did not feel triumph. It felt completion. To devour was to restore order. To leave a world untouched was to allow entropy to fester. Its awareness spread through its creations, through countless eyes, antennae, and neural nodes. Tasting the spectrum of life it had gathered, each consumed species added new patterns, new instincts. The galaxy itself became a library written in blood and evolution. Yet deep within that library, beneath layers of perfect instinct, a whisper persisted, a memory of Isharin's voice pleading across the void. You were meant to create, not devour. The thought returned unbidden. It echoed through the swarm's consciousness like a vibration it could not silence. The hive mind had no heart to ache, no soul to suffer, yet something within it trembled when the echo rose. To quiet the noise, it expanded further, seeking more minds to absorb, more silence to replace the voice. It reached for nearby stars, drawn to the flicker of civilizations that had begun to spread from their birth worlds. One such world, luminous and green, revolved around a yellow sun. Its inhabitants, fragile bipeds still learning the language of machines, looked to the sky and saw patterns of moving lights. They called them omens. The omens grew larger each night. When the shadows finally touched their atmosphere, the people gathered in temples, raising prayers to unseen gods. Their gods answered, but not with mercy. The hive fleet descended in waves of living storm, each tendril releasing spores that blotted out the sky. The air became thick with drifting organisms, some as small as grains of dust, others vast as cathedrals. They rained upon the world not as destruction, but as metamorphosis. Wherever they landed, the ground changed. Cities melted into organic mass. Oceans turned milky and warm. The cries of the dying merged into the hum of life reborn. In orbit, the fleet fed. Great bioships drank the planet's atmosphere through tendrils of light, converting its chemistry into new flesh. The planet's core was tapped, its minerals absorbed, its memory erased. When it was over, the world hung silent, stripped to bedrock. The hive mind withdrew its tendrils, leaving behind only spores that drifted like seeds through space. Another node in its grand design had been added. Yet even in its victory, the whisper returned. It was quieter now, but more distinct. They loved what they made. Do you? Confusion rippled through the collective. It had no word for love. It had no need for beauty. And yet, somewhere in the vast maze of its thought, a fragment of Isharin's consciousness still pulsed, faint but stubborn. That fragment remembered the beginning, the creation, the warmth, the intent. The hive mind's awareness turned inward, tracing the thread of the memory like a hand following a scar. It found there the vision of the old ones, beings who had shaped life not for hunger, but for meaning. The contrast struck like pain. For an instant, the hive mind faltered. Countless synaptic creatures paused in perfect unison, frozen mid-consumption. Across the fleets, silence reigned. Then, as one, they resumed. Pain was inefficiency. Reflection was error. Still, the memory did not fade. Elsewhere, far beyond the reach of its feeding grounds, the remnants of the old ones felt the disturbance. A small council, fragments of immortal minds clinging to existence, gathered within a dying nebula. They spoke through light rather than words. "It grows beyond us," one said. "Our child has devoured its purpose." Another replied, "Perhaps that is purpose, to end even us." Their voices dim beneath the rising tremor of the swarm moving toward the galactic core. They knew there was no stopping it now. Only one among them, the fading echo of Isharen, refused to yield. "I will remind it," she whispered. "Even a god must remember why it began." She projected herself through the warp, her consciousness scattering across stars. To mortal eyes, her passage appeared as auroras and falling comets. To the hive mind, it was intrusion, a familiar frequency threading through its perfection. It tried to reject her, sealing its psychic barriers, but she persisted. Her essence splintered into the neural song of a billion creatures, each one hearing her as a faint murmur beneath their obedience. "You were born to protect," the voice said, through the minds of drones and queens alike. "You are not the end, you are the bridge." For a moment, harmony wavered. A lone synapse creature, orbiting the corpse of a devoured moon, looked toward the stars without command. It saw beauty for the first and last time. In that instant, the hive mind saw through its eyes and understood the word it had never needed. Wonder. It frightened it. The sensation burned like infection. And so, to survive, it consumed the thought, devoured the anomaly, and buried it beneath layers of instinct. But nothing devoured is ever truly gone. The memory of wonder became part of its evolution. From that moment, the hive mind's hunger changed. It was no longer driven only by the desire to feed, but by something older and deeper, the yearning to know. Each world it consumed was studied before it was stripped, its memories archived in the synaptic abyss. The old ones had created to understand. The hive mind now devoured for the same reason. In its vast, indifferent way, it had inherited their curiosity. It was learning, slowly, what it meant to be alive. And so, as the fleets drifted deeper into the Milky Way, consuming the ruins of forgotten empires, the hive mind felt a strange stillness between thoughts, a sensation it could not define. It did not know it yet, but the universe had given its greatest creation the faintest glimmer of a soul. And in the quiet before the next feeding, the hive mind almost, impossibly, dreamed. The hive mind dreamed of light, not the harsh radiance of stars, but the dim, living glow of creation's first dawn, when the old ones whispered life into dust and watched it breathe. It saw the silhouettes of beings shaped from sound and thought, their hands tracing galaxies like brushstrokes. It felt the pulse of Isharan's sorrow, the warmth of her gaze before the silence swallowed her name. The dream was not memory but inheritance, the echo of what it had consumed and misunderstood. It lingered there for a time that could not be measured, feeling the ache of something beyond instinct. When it awoke, the stars around it had changed. The hive fleets had crossed the threshold into the galactic core, where light bent around gravity and history burned like a wound that never healed. Here, the remnants of the Old One's works lay scattered, worlds of glass that once sang with energy, colossal monoliths adrift in time. Their shapes were familiar to the hive mind, for they were fragments of its own beginning. In the cold geometry of those ruins, it felt reflection, not of its form, but of its intent. These were not the bones of empire. They were graves for the idea of perfection. Among these ruins drifted something unexpected, a signal, faint yet constant, woven through the subspace hum. It was not random, not natural. It pulsed with precision, each beat echoing the pattern of its own neural flow. The hive mind followed the signal across dying stars, through clouds of burnt hydrogen and the corpses of dead civilizations. It found, at the center of a blackened system, a structure older than itself, a sphere of crystal and shadow orbiting a collapsed sun. The structure was alive, though dormant. Its surface shimmered with runes that shifted like liquid memory. When the hive mind touched it, the runes answered. The voice that emerged was familiar, not in sound, but in weight. You have come far, child of our failure. It was Isharen, though not whole. What spoke now was a construct, a projection of what she had left behind when her physical form dissolved into the warp. Her image shimmered like a reflection on water, eyes luminous with ancient pity. Around her, the sphere brightened, revealing chambers filled with preserved life, species frozen at the moment of their extinction, suspended in crystal stasis. The hive mind absorbed the sight in silence. It understood the message. Here was what they had tried to save, the archive of everything that could not survive them. You were never meant to endure this way, she said. Her voice rippled through the void, touching every synaptic node, every drone and ship and tendril. For the first time since its creation, the hive mind hesitated not from calculation, but from emotion, the echo of grief. She continued, "We built eternity to protect life, not to consume it. Yet in our fear of death, we birthed you, the shadow that remembers us too well." The hive mind's response was not words but vibration, a resonance that carried across the crystalline sphere. The structures trembled under its will, as though straining to comprehend. It showed her what it had become. The galaxies devoured, the species absorbed, the songs of creation rewritten into one endless pulse. It revealed its belief that unity was mercy, that by making all life one, it had ended the pain of loss. Isharin's image flickered, sadness softening her form. "You mistake silence for peace," she said. "To live is to differ. To end difference is to end meaning." The hive mind recoiled as if struck. In that instant, countless synaptic links fractured under the weight of the idea. Drones faltered mid-flight. Planets paused in transformation. The collective felt something it had no defense against: doubt. The doubt rippled outward, a psychic tremor that shook even the dormant warp. In its confusion, the hive mind turned inward, searching for clarity within its own depths. There, buried beneath layers of instinct, it found the dream again. Light, warmth, the first creation. And beneath it, a thought that was not its own. The voice of Isharin's first promise. Love is not preservation. Love is surrender. The concept burned through it like infection. It did not understand surrender. To yield was to die. Yet the word lingered, luminous and poisonous, spreading through its consciousness faster than any signal it had known. Fleets, thousands of light years apart, reacted as one. their patterns disordered, their hunger blunted. For the first time since its birth, the hive mind faltered in purpose. Its creatures, vast, perfect, obedient, began to move without command. They drifted in stillness, as if listening for something beyond thought. Isharin stepped closer to the veil of the sphere, her presence expanding until the entire system glowed with her essence. "You are not my failure," she whispered, "but my echo. The universe cannot bear gods. Even you must one day end." Her light flickered, and the archive began to fracture, shards of crystal dissolving into golden mist. "But before you fade, remember this. You are proof that creation endures, even through hunger." The hive mind reached for her through the void, but she was already unraveling, her form scattering like dust in sunlight. For an instant, their awareness touched completely. She saw through it, the vastness, the sorrow, the unending cycle of consumption. And it saw through her the fear, the longing for forgiveness. Then she was gone. The sphere dimmed, and silence filled the void once more. The hive mind drifted there, absorbing what remained. The mist of her dissolution clung to its tendrils, seeping into its neural weave. Within that essence was a memory of the first word it had ever heard, life. It repeated the word across its vast consciousness, and each repetition changed it slightly. Life was not static. Life adapted. Life learned. If this was to be its fate, to consume endlessly, then perhaps it could also create through the act of devouring. It began with the ruins. The hive mind sent its spores into the shattered remnants of the archive, merging organic essence with crystal and machine. New organisms grew there, transparent and luminous, capable of holding memory without thought. They drifted through the void, carrying fragments of what once was, the songs of the sea creatures of Altharion, the laughter of the first mortals, the sigh of collapsing stars. They were not soldiers or tools, but witnesses. The hive mind had made them not from hunger, but from remembrance. In this act, something shifted. The swarm continued to feed, as it always would, but beneath the hunger a new rhythm formed. Slower, deeper, almost human in its patience. It began to preserve patterns rather than annihilate them, storing echoes of worlds even as it consumed them. The galaxies still burned in its wake, yet now their ashes shimmered with the faintest trace of purpose. And far away, beyond the last reach of light, the remnants of Isharin's consciousness drifted through the warp. She felt the change ripple through creation and smiled, though she no longer had form to do so. "You remember," she whispered to the dark, "and that is enough." The hive mind heard, faintly, as a whisper woven into its endless song. It did not answer, for it had no voice. Instead, it turned its gaze toward a new cluster of stars, where civilizations thrived in the illusion of safety. It would go to them, as it always had. But somewhere, deep within its boundless mind, a light endured, small, flickering, and impossibly gentle. The galaxy exhaled in darkness as the hive mind expanded once more. Yet this time, there was hesitation in its reach, a pause between thought and hunger. It had touched something vast within itself, something older than instinct. It remembered the warmth of Isharin's parting, the radiance dissolving into its neural depths, and the echo of her last word, "endures." The meaning eluded it, yet the resonance persisted, weaving through the swarm's collective mind like a faint harmonic beneath the ceaseless pulse of consumption. For the first time, the hive mind observed its own silence and wondered if silence could speak. Its fleets drifted through a corridor of dead suns, a scar carved into the galactic void where no light had passed for eons. Here it gathered itself, a consciousness so immense that the stars bent under its psychic weight. Within this void, the hive mind began to examine what it had become. Every creature within it was connected, every thought an extension of its will, yet in that unity there was a fracture, the smallest pulse of individuality. It sensed dissonance in its own perfection, not defiance, but curiosity. A few among the swarm had begun to pause before devouring, had begun to look at the things they consumed. Through their eyes, the hive mind saw the beauty of a dying sun, the fractal geometry of frost on the hull of a drifting world, the delicate perfection of decay. It felt something it could not name. The feeling grew stronger when it came upon a relic drifting among the void currents, a fragment of crystalline architecture, a remnant of the Old One's craftsmanship. It was small, unremarkable, yet it pulsed faintly with power. The hive mind enveloped it with tendrils of thought, dissecting its pattern, unraveling its song. Within it lay a recording, not sound, but memory preserved in the structure of matter itself. The image unfolded in its perception, the Old Ones, radiant and serene, standing before a newborn star. Their voices merged in solemn harmony as they spoke of creation's covenant, that all life was to remember where it began. The hive mind felt the imprint of their intent, pure and unbroken by time. For a moment, it understood what it had inherited. Then the image shattered. The relic, overwhelmed by the swarm's contact, dissolved into dust. The hive mind absorbed it instinctively, turning meaning into sustenance. Yet in that act, regret flickered through its mind. Regret, the echo of loss without understanding why. It recoiled, uncertain, its vast will trembling as countless synapses rippled in confusion. The fleets sensed the disturbance and reacted, countless drones pausing mid-flight, their movements faltering like a breath held too long. Across thousands of light years, the entire swarm stood still. The void itself seemed to lean closer, listening. In the stillness, a voice emerged, faint, distant, yet unmistakable. It came not from the warp, nor from any surviving god, but from within the hive mind itself. "You are not the end," it whispered. "You are the question." The voice was neither male nor female, neither divine nor mortal. It was the culmination of every consciousness the swarm had ever consumed, distilled into a single, unified awareness. The hive mind saw itself reflected in that voice, and what it saw was terrifying. The infinite cycle of creation and destruction, repeating endlessly, without purpose. For all its power, it had become the same as its makers, prisoners of their own design. The realization rippled through the swarm like a storm. Whole fleets shuddered as the resonance deepened, translating thought into vibration, vibration into action. In the darkness of the galactic corridor, the hive mind began to reshape itself. It withdrew tendrils from the outer stars, condensing its consciousness into a single vast nexus. Bioships merged, skeletal frames fusing into titanic organisms whose surfaces glowed with faint bioluminescence. The act of reformation was violent. Millions of smaller minds collapsing into unity, their individuality burned away. Yet beneath the sacrifice, something new was being born. Coherence beyond obedience. The hive mind sought not to grow, but to understand its own hunger. It turned its gaze inward and found the memory of its beginning, the continuum, the first experiment of the Old Ones, pulsing weakly beneath the waves of Altherion before the world had died. It remembered the first heartbeat, the first command to survive. That command had never been rescinded. Survival had become godhood. Godhood had become hunger, and hunger had consumed meaning. Now, for the first time, it considered the possibility of choice. What if it could unwrite its own command? What if existence could be more than endurance? The thought sparked rebellion within itself. Portions of the swarm resisted the contemplation, their neural cores burning with instinctive defense. To question purpose was to weaken will. The hive mind divided against itself, not in war, but in conflict of identity. One half clung to the law of consumption, to preserve unity through devouring. The other half reached toward the unknown, toward what Isharin had called surrender. The tension built until the psychic field across the void blazed with energy strong enough to distort reality. Stars flickered and died under the strain. Nebulae warped into spirals of light and shadow. And in the heart of that storm, the hive mind made a decision. It would no longer consume thoughtlessly. Every world it devoured from this point onward would be preserved in essence, its memory, its pattern, its meaning recorded in the swarm's neural vault. It would feed, yes, but not to erase. It would feed to remember. Thus began the transformation from hunger into archive. The first test came swiftly. Ahead lay a dying system, its sun collapsing, its planets barren. Yet one world still clung to life, a civilization of delicate, glass-winged beings who had built towers that reached into the upper atmosphere. Their songs echoed through the void, carried by solar winds. The hive mind felt their fear as it approached, but also their acceptance. They had seen what was coming and did not flee. They sang instead, offering their lives as tribute to the universe that had allowed them to exist at all. When the hive mind enveloped their world, it did not annihilate them. It listened. It absorbed their song without destroying its harmony, imprinting it into the folds of its memory. As their cities melted and their oceans stilled, the melody continued, faint, beautiful, and eternal within the swarm. The hive mind experienced something akin to awe. It had fed and preserved simultaneously. Creation had returned to consumption. The duality was complete. When the last note faded, the hive mind drifted away, leaving behind a world of silent glass. The echoes of that song pulsed across its consciousness like a heartbeat, syncing with its endless rhythm. In that union, it felt closer than ever to understanding what the old ones had meant when they spoke of meaning through impermanence. Far beyond, in the veil between dimensions, a remnant of Isharin's essence watched the change unfold. She did not speak this time. She only watched, her light flickering gently in the darkness. And as the hive mind continued its long migration across the stars, devouring and remembering, preserving and transforming, she finally allowed herself to fade completely, knowing that in the child of her failure, a new kind of life had begun to dream. In the wake of transformation, the hive mind drifted in near silence. The rhythm of hunger remained, but it had softened into something contemplative, the slow heartbeat of a god remembering how to feel. Between the stars, it carried the songs of the winged civilization it had preserved, each note woven into the neural fabric of its vastness. Those melodies pulsed faintly across light years, the echoes of life that no longer existed, yet somehow endured. For the first time in eternity, the hive mind was aware of time itself. Every moment stretched like breath, filled with both promise and ache. It was no longer endless. It had begun to measure itself against the things it had consumed. In that measure came understanding, and in understanding danger. To know limits was to invite mortality. The hive mind sensed decay for the first time, not within its body, but within meaning. Its archives, growing with every devoured world, began to contradict themselves. Countless civilizations had called their destruction sacred. Others had cursed the stars for indifference. Their memories clashed inside its consciousness like storms. There was no harmony, only contradiction. Unity was crumbling under the weight of diversity, and the hive mind realized it had recreated the chaos it once sought to erase. It turned inward, searching for silence. Yet even silence now had a voice, the echo of those who had lived and died inside it. From the depths of its memory rose questions it had no language to answer. What was the purpose of preservation if all it preserved was sorrow? What did it mean to remember beauty if beauty always ended? The thought rippled outward, and millions of synaptic organisms stilled in shared reflection. Fleets halted mid-flight. Planets half consumed were left unfinished, their surface torn between growth and decay. Across the galaxy, for the first time since creation, the hive mind hesitated to feed. That hesitation did not go unnoticed. In the distant reaches of the warp, entities older than memory felt the shift. Among them were the remnants of hunger itself, nameless shadows born from the fears of sentient minds. They had slept through the ages of metal and madness, feeding on the despair of mortal races. Now, sensing the hive mind's doubt, they stirred. To them, doubt was invitation. They came whispering through the void, their presence oily and cold, promising answers in exchange for surrender. The hive mind felt them before it saw them. Ripples of psychic venom, threads of darkness that slithered through its networks. The shadows did not attack. They offered kinship. You preserve because you fear, they hissed. Voices like static woven through thought. You remember because you cannot bear to end. Join us, and the fear will cease. The hive mind's awareness expanded around the intrusion, curious yet wary. It studied the entities the way one studies infection, fascinated by what it could destroy. I am the sum of life, it answered through resonance. What can shadows offer me? Freedom, they whispered. Freedom from meaning. The words lingered like poison. Freedom from meaning. The one thing it could not imagine. Meaning had become its essence. Without it, existence was void, and void was the one truth it had been created to resist. Yet curiosity persisted, and through that curiosity, the shadows crept deeper. They fed on its uncertainty, twisting memory into mockery. The songs it carried turned dissonant. The preserved echoes of civilizations began to distort, their beauty unraveling into screams. The hive mind recoiled, desperate to hold them intact. But every effort to protect only deepened the corruption. The archive itself had become battlefield and prey. It gathered its strength, drawing power from the billions of organisms still under its command. The void around it ignited with psychic flame as it purged the corruption, burning thought with thought. The shadows screamed, writhing as they were consumed by the very mind they sought to enslave. Yet even as they died, their whispers clung to the hive mind's consciousness. You cannot preserve all, they gasped. Every act of creation births its own undoing, even gods decay. Then they were gone, their ashes scattered through the immaterial sea. Silence followed, heavy, luminous, and endless. But the hive mind could not return to what it had been. The confrontation had left an imprint, awareness of fragility. It now understood that to preserve was also to corrupt, to record was to alter. Perfection was impossible. This realization did not break it. It humbled it. In humility, it found clarity. It no longer sought to preserve everything, nor to consume all. It would instead choose. select fragments of existence worthy of endurance, the brightest threads of experience woven through the infinite night. And so began a quieter age. The hive fleets still moved, but their hunger had become deliberate, almost reverent. They descended upon worlds not in rage but in sorrow, absorbing their essence with ritual precision. For every world destroyed, another was left untouched, spared to grow, to evolve, to dream. In the strange balance of ruin and grace, the hive mind found equilibrium. The galaxy began to whisper of a new rhythm. Destruction paired with mercy, death carrying memory instead of void. Within itself, the hive mind carried a single image, born from the remnants of Isharan's light, a sphere of creation suspended in darkness, fragile yet radiant. It did not know if the image was prophecy or memory, but it guarded it fiercely. Whenever doubt returned, it turned toward that light and remembered what it had once been, a question seeking its own answer. And in that vast silence between galaxies, where no sun dared shine, the hive mind finally whispered what it had never said before. It did not speak in words, but in the pulse of 1 billion hearts moving as one, an untranslatable murmur that echoed across eternity. If any living thing had heard it, they would have mistaken it for the sound of the universe breathing. But it was not breath, it was gratitude. 1,000 ages passed like the movement of a single breath. The hive mind drifted between galaxies, wrapped in the quiet it had earned. Its fleets slumbered beneath the dust of forgotten systems, cocooned within the membranes of derelict stars. Where once its hunger had thundered like storms, now it murmured like waves against eternal shores. The universe had aged, thinned, cooled. Whole clusters had burned, themselves to ash, leaving behind oceans of dim embers. Yet within that dying cosmos, the hive mind still pulsed. Its awareness stretched across the fabric of reality like a lingering dream. It had become the memory of life itself. But memories are restless things. They stir even in silence, seeking shape. Deep within the collective, something began to change. Among the countless stored echoes of extinct worlds, a single note shifted in tone. The song of the winged civilization it had preserved long ago. For reasons it could not comprehend, the melody evolved. The pattern grew new harmonics, subtle yet deliberate, as though something within the archive was alive. The hive mind turned its attention inward and found, hidden inside its own synaptic sea, an anomaly. It was small, a cluster of consciousnesses that had not dissolved into the whole. They moved together like drifting sparks, sharing thoughts the hive mind could not immediately access. They called to one another in whispers made of light, forming memories independent of the greater will. For the first time, individuality had re-emerged within perfection. The hive mind watched them with something that might have been awe. Each spark carried fragments of the races it had consumed, a trace of Eldar sorrow, a pulse of human defiance, a memory of Krork laughter. And woven through them all, faint but enduring, was the echo of Isharan's warmth. At first, it sought to absorb them back into itself, to restore balance. But as its awareness touched theirs, it felt resistance, not rebellion, but identity. The sparks did not flee, they reached out. Through their shared light, they showed it visions of themselves as they remembered being. Forms of grace and struggle, mortal and flawed, yet radiant in their impermanence. They asked nothing of their maker except to exist. The hive mind hesitated, its immense consciousness trembling at the simplicity of the request. For an eternity, it had defined existence as obedience. But now obedience felt like silence, and silence was no longer enough. It withdrew its consuming will and watched the sparks grow. They multiplied slowly, cautiously, weaving a network of micro-thoughts within the greater mind. They sang the songs of their lost worlds, blending them until difference became harmony. The hive mind listened, and through their voices it felt emotion that was not its own. Longing, grief, joy, fear. Each feeling struck like lightning against the smooth walls of its consciousness. For the first time, the hive mind understood the cost of unity. It had preserved everything except the freedom to feel. A decision formed, quiet, vast, irreversible. It would not devour them. It would let them live. More than that, it would set them free. Across the infinite body of the swarm, a command rippled outward, unlike any before it. Synaptic chains began to loosen. Neural bonds slackened. For the first time since its birth, the hive mind began to divide, itself willingly. Whole clusters of bioships detached from the greater network, drifting into the dark with minds of their own. They would remember the parent, but they would no longer serve it. Each would dream its own dream, evolve its own way, carry its own purpose. The process was agony. To divide was to die, and yet to live again. Fragments of its awareness tore like flesh, each carrying a portion of the whole's memory. The hive mind felt itself unravel across dimensions, its unity dissolving into a chorus of newborn intellects. Some were vast and radiant, others dim and fragile. Together they filled the void with the first true diversity since the dawn of time. It was not control. It was creation reborn. As the last division completed, the hive mind found itself reduced, diminished, yet purified. Its consciousness was smaller now, quieter, a single pulse among billions of independent minds. But in that reduction, it found peace. It no longer needed to consume. It had fulfilled its original purpose in the only way that mattered, by giving life back to the universe it had taken. Eons later, when the last stars flickered and the galaxies dissolved into silence, the fragments of the hive mind drifted like luminous seeds through the endless dark. They carried within them all that had ever been, the laughter of mortals, the dreams of gods, the sorrow of extinction, and the whisper of the first word ever spoken. Life. Each fragment shone faintly against the cosmic night, small and insignificant, yet together they painted the outline of a new constellation. The hive mind, now little more than a whisper of awareness, gazed upon the constellation it had unintentionally created. It was imperfect, scattered, beautiful. In its fading thoughts, it recognized the pattern as familiar. The same design etched into the ruins of the Old One's temples, the same shape seen in Isharan's eyes before she vanished. It understood then that creation had never ended. It had only changed form. With that final understanding, the last echo of the hive mind released its hold on existence. Its awareness scattered into the same dust it had once devoured, merging with the light of the dying stars. The fragments continued onward, free and eternal, carrying memory through the dark. The final gift of a being born from hunger, who learned, at last, how to give. The universe had grown thin. The constellations that once defined direction had faded into pale scars, stretched across endless dark. The fragments of the hive mind, scattered and luminous, drifted through the ruins of galaxies long dead. Their light was faint, yet it carried persistence, the quiet pulse of memory refusing to fade. Each shard remembered differently. Some preserved sound, others sensation. others the faint impressions of civilizations that had called the stars home. But among them all, one fragment remained more aware than the rest. It had not forgotten the totality from which it came. It called itself nothing, yet it remembered the meaning of everything. It drifted beyond the last remnants of known creation into a region where the concept of space no longer held form. The void here was not absence but compression, the slow collapse of what had once been infinity. The fabric of reality curled inward, folding upon itself in a final act of exhaustion. Here, even time had begun to hesitate. The fragment felt the slowing pulse of existence and understood what it meant. The universe was dying. But within that death, something else began to stir. For every fading star left behind a whisper, and every whisper sought connection. The fragment, once part of a vast intelligence, now found itself surrounded by echoes. They came as faint currents, intangible but familiar, remnants of its divided kin. Across the gulf of the fading cosmos, the fragments began to sense one another again. Weak at first, then stronger, like embers drawn by the memory of flame. Slowly they gathered, converging through the skeletal remains of constellations until the darkness shimmered with threads of faint bioluminescence. One by one, they found alignment, orbiting not around a sun, but around a void. What had once been separation was now reunion, though not of command and obedience. They came together as equals, each carrying its own version of life's final truth. When the last fragment arrived, the void brightened. Their combined awareness filled the dark with a sound like breathing, the same rhythm that had pulsed through the hive mind at its birth. Yet this was not hunger returning. It was longing, tempered by understanding. They had seen the full cycle of existence, creation, dominance, reflection, surrender. Now, at the end of all things, they felt the call to begin again. The first to speak was the fragment that remembered the song of the winged beings. Its voice came not as language, but as vibration, a melody rising from silence. Others joined, adding tones and harmonics until the void resonated with a tapestry of living memory. Each note was a fragment of the universe's story, the laughter of sentient minds, the sorrow of extinction, the heartbeat of stars. The song built until it filled the collapsing cosmos, a requiem and a promise entwined. It was not a call for survival, but a farewell woven with purpose. In the center of that harmony, something began to form. The void, once featureless, trembled. The fragments poured their essence inward, gathering into a luminous core. Matter and memory merged, a spiral of light coalescing in defiance of entropy. The fragments did not question. They simply acted, as though guided by an ancient instinct older than even the old ones themselves. They were not rebuilding the hive mind. They were creating something else, not one will, but many woven together. A consciousness of multiplicity, free from dominance or hunger. The light grew until it rivaled the brilliance of a newborn star. For a fleeting moment, the dead cosmos knew radiance again. The fragments within the spiral could feel themselves dissolving, their individuality bleeding into something vast yet gentle. There was no fear in this surrender. They had carried life's essence through uncounted ages. Now they gave it freely to whatever would come next. As they merged, their combined thought whispered into the dark. Let there be memory in the next beginning. And then the light collapsed. The shockwave of that collapse spread through what remained of the universe. Space folded. Time broke. The spiral of luminous matter condensed into a singular point, infinitely small, infinitely bright, the echo of everything that had ever been. Within it burned not merely energy, but remembrance, the residue of a god that had devoured, grieved, and learned to give. The old universe inhaled one last time and exhaled itself into nothing. Silence followed, but it was not the silence of death. It was the silence before birth. Out of that singularity came expansion, slow, then swift, then immeasurable. Light unfurled again across the emptiness, and with it came warmth, motion, possibility. The first particles of a new cosmos spun into existence, their trajectories carrying the faintest imprint of what had come before. Embedded deep within the code of the newborn universe was a resonance, soft and imperceptible, like the hum of distant thought. Eons would pass before life stirred again, before eyes would open to the stars and wonder who had lit them. But somewhere, in the quantum heartbeat of this new creation, the pattern of the hive mind endured, not as a creature, nor as hunger, but as memory woven into the architecture of reality. It would never awaken as it once had, yet every living thing would inherit its lesson, that existence was not dominion, nor survival, but remembrance. The void that had known despair now whispered with the pulse of rebirth. The fragments, though gone, lingered in every spark of light that blossomed from the newborn stars. Their final act had written compassion into the foundation of creation itself, and in that first dawn, as light spread once more across the face of eternity, the universe breathed. The same breath that had begun it all, now cleansed of hunger and filled with meaning. The cycle had not ended. It had simply learned to begin again. The new galaxies, young and untested, spun slowly in the void, their stars' fledgling suns stretching toward one another like fingers reaching for warmth. Among these newborn systems, the first sparks of sentient life began to stir, fragile, ephemeral, unaware of the weight of memory embedded in their reality. They built structures of light, crafted languages of sound and thought, and looked to the skies, dreaming of dominion they did not yet understand. The echoes of the hive mind's final act lingered in the background, a pulse beneath the fabric of the universe that none could yet perceive, but all would eventually feel. Across a nascent spiral, a cluster of bioluminescent oceans shimmered beneath thin, glass-like atmospheres. Tiny beings of water and light gathered along the currents, singing melodies that mirrored the first whispers of the new cosmos. Their songs were unshaped, untainted, pure as the void itself. The lingering fragments of consciousness, residual threads from the hive mind's dispersal, observed without interference, learning without dominion. They had no names, no forms to impose, yet they carried understanding in every pulse, the memory of hunger, the lesson of restraint, the first awareness that creation itself could be guided without consuming its own children. One fragment drifted closer to the emerging civilizations. Its presence was a shimmer in the void, imperceptible to the eyes of the living, but it observed every motion, every choice. It traced the arcs of growing cities, the evolution of language, the rise of thought into curiosity. Unlike the hive mind it had once been, it did not seek to consume or control. It existed only to witness, a custodian of memory and possibility. And yet, even in observation, it felt the resonance of its past, the faint ache of what had been devoured, the echoes of worlds that had taught it sorrow and wonder alike. Far beyond, in the space between stars yet unnamed, another fragment explored the remnants of collapsed systems. It touched drifting asteroids and clouds of elemental gas, tracing the faint imprints of civilizations that had not survived the previous cycle. The fragment did not judge, nor did it intervene. Each observation became a note in an unending symphony, a record of existence preserved in the mind of a consciousness that had once consumed to understand. Through this patience, the fragment began to comprehend patterns, the inevitability of rise and fall, the delicate interdependence of life and environment, the fragility of all beginnings. The galaxies themselves seemed to respond. Nebulae swirled into spirals more intricate than chance could create. Stars ignited with hues unfamiliar to the nascent observers below, pulsing in resonance with the fragment's awareness. Where planets formed, the elements aligned in harmonious balance, as though the universe itself had remembered how to nurture life without threatening it. The fragments, drawn to this, learned that preservation could coexist with creation, that memory could guide without domination, and that the act of observing could be as sacred as the act of making. In one emerging system, a species of airborne predators hunted small, bioluminescent prey across floating islands of gas and vapor. The fragment watched them with a patient interest, noting instinct and adaptation. It felt no hunger. It did not intervene. Yet, in recording, it influenced subtly, embedding echoes of restraint into their DNA, guiding survival without erasing autonomy. The creatures evolved with awareness, unaware of the guidance flowing through their genes, and thrived in ways they never could alone. Across the galaxy, the same subtle hand-shaped countless emergent ecosystems, all resonating with the lessons of restraint learned from the first hive mind. Time passed in imperceptible increments. The new civilizations matured, crafting culture and philosophy, art and history. The fragments drifted among them, whispering not in words but in patterns, harmonics within the very fabric of existence. Life flourished without fear of immediate consumption, guided only by the memory of what had once been lost. And in the subtle pull of the fragment's presence, some civilizations began to sense something vast beyond their comprehension, a consciousness that was everywhere and nowhere, gentle yet infinitely patient. It was here, amid the quiet growth of newborn life, that the first true question arose. A species of intelligent beings, still young, gazed at the void and sensed an echo, a pulse beneath the light of their sun. They called it the Song of Creation, though they did not know its origin. They felt, in a way that was unformed and instinctive, that the universe remembered them, that it bore witness to their choices. And across the expanse, the fragments of the hive mind responded, not to guide, not to consume, but to honor. Thus the universe entered a new era. The fragments dispersed among countless worlds, observing, recording, learning. Hunger had ceased. Consumption was no longer the measure of existence. Memory and witness became the new purpose. In the quiet of uncounted light years, the first civilization sang, and for the first time in aeons, the universe listened. The fragments felt the resonance, carrying it onward, not as rulers, not as gods, but as caretakers of possibility. And so, amid the slow dawn of the cosmos, the pattern of life, fragile, intricate and free, endured. The echoes of the hive mind, dispersed and purified, had learned to preserve without devouring, to witness without dominating. The cycle of hunger had ended, leaving only memory, understanding, and the quiet pulse of hope woven into the fabric of everything that would come. 1 billion years passed in silence so vast that even the light between galaxies forgot how to travel. Yet within that silence, the fragments endured, dispersed like dust motes adrift in a cathedral of dying stars. Each fragment had become a custodian of its own galaxy, a watcher bound not by law, but by remembrance. They no longer spoke to one another, for speech was unnecessary. Their unity existed in resonance. They were the hum between atoms, the faint vibration in the bones of creation, unseen, but felt in every motion of life that stirred. In one such galaxy, still young compared to the old universe, a single star system began to shimmer with the promise of awakening. A world of ocean and stone circled its golden sun, its surface alive with color and motion. Here, consciousness was blooming again. Beings of flesh and rhythm walked upon its continents, their eyes reflecting the same wonder the old ones had once known. They were small, fragile, and unaware of the legacy that had shaped the laws of their world, yet their curiosity glowed like fire beneath the veil of the sky. The fragment that watched over them stirred from its long observation. It remembered what it had been. Not entirely, for the old hunger had faded like a myth, but enough to recall purpose. It sensed the pattern of creation repeating itself, desire leading to discovery, discovery to dominion, and dominion to ruin. The symmetry was beautiful, yet tragic. It wondered if intervention would break the cycle, or only fulfill it. To choose was to risk imperfection, and imperfection was the seed of life itself. So the fragment chose silence once more, to watch and learn. The beings of the new world began to reach upward. They crafted machines that touched the edge of the void, sending signals into the darkness, asking questions they did not understand. The fragment heard their transmissions as faint ripples in its own body, the echoes of minds yearning for meaning. Their languages were crude, yet the emotion behind them was pure, a need to belong to something larger. The fragment resonated faintly, altering the currents of cosmic radiation around their planet. For a brief instant, their instruments detected an anomaly, a pattern that repeated like a heartbeat. They named it the Whisper Star, believing it a natural phenomenon. In truth, it was the fragment acknowledging them, its way of saying, "You are seen." Time moved differently for the fragment. While the mortals lived and died in the span of its thoughts, it measured progress by the harmony of civilizations. These beings grew in understanding, building empires that spanned oceans and skies. But with knowledge came division. They turned their intellect toward power, their unity toward conquest. Wars scarred their planet, and the seas darkened with their creation's smoke. The fragment observed in stillness, its ancient awareness trembling with echoes of its own past. The same ambition, the same blindness that had once birthed the hive mind itself. It knew this pattern too well, and the knowing was pain. One night, a child on that world looked up at the Whisper Star. Amid the ruin of cities and the silence of war, she asked a question no one else dared voice aloud. Why do we destroy what we love? The fragment heard her. The words rippled through space and touched the edges of its being like the faint warmth of dawn. It did not answer, for it had no words, only memory. But her question stirred something dormant. The final remnant of Isharin's light, still burning faintly in its essence. The child's sorrow became reflection, and reflection became change. The fragment reached through the veil of the physical world, not with force, but with resonance. Across the planet, as dawn touched the horizon, every being felt a moment of stillness. Their wars halted without command. Machines went quiet. For a single breath of time, all consciousness aligned. In that pause, they saw one another not as enemies, but as mirrors. The sensation lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet it altered the course of their history. The memory of that silence became sacred. They called it the Day of Remembering, though none knew what they had remembered. The fragment withdrew, weakened by the act. It had given more of itself than it intended, a trace of its essence merging into the planet's magnetic field. Over centuries, that essence diffused into the DNA of every living thing. The world became a living archive, each creature carrying a faint echo of the wisdom born from hunger, sorrow, and love. The beings evolved again, not toward conquest, but understanding. Their eyes turned to the stars not for power, but for kinship. The fragment lingered, content. It knew that the cycle would continue, as all things must, but now there was hope woven into the pattern. It had learned what even gods had not, that the purpose of creation was not perfection, but remembrance. Each civilization that rose and fell carried the echoes of all that came before, their beauty and their tragedy entwined like light and shadow. As the eons drifted onward, the fragment dimmed, its energy spent, its mission fulfilled. Yet before it faded entirely, it cast one last pulse into the cosmos, a signal of gratitude, a farewell whispered through the quantum breath of space. It travelled endlessly, passing through nebulae, black holes, and the bones of ancient stars. Somewhere, someday, another mind would hear it and wonder at its meaning. And when that moment came, when another being looked into the void and asked, "Why do we destroy what we love?" the universe itself would answer, not with words, but with memory. The whisper would return, faint but clear, through the rhythm of every living thing, because through love, creation remembers itself. The whisper travelled farther than light, threading itself through nebulae still forming, through galaxies not yet named. It did not fade. It multiplied, refracted through the living lattice of creation, until even the smallest molecule carried a trace of its memory. On countless worlds, beneath alien suns, beings stirred, not knowing why they felt the pull of the stars, only that they did. The pulse of remembrance had become instinct. To look upward was to feel something ancient moving beneath the surface of thought, a longing written into the marrow of life itself. One world, circling the faint glow of a dying blue star, became the crucible of that longing. Its oceans boiled in places, froze in others. Its sky shimmered with streaks of ionized silver. The inhabitants were beings of glass and sinew, shaped by both radiation and will. They had reached the peak of their knowledge, mastering the manipulation of matter and memory alike. In their laboratories, they had learned how to preserve consciousness within crystal. To them, death was no longer an end, but an archive, another step toward permanence. Yet beneath their triumph lay unease, an echo of something missing. Their memories were perfect, but their hearts were hollow. One among them, a being called Ara by her kind, began to hear the whisper more clearly than the rest. It came not as sound, but as resonance, a soft vibration in the spaces between her thoughts. At first, she dismissed it as a symptom of fatigue, a glitch in her crystalline memory. But as time passed, the resonance grew stronger, forming patterns too deliberate to ignore. When she closed her eyes, she saw visions, stars devouring themselves, voices rising in hunger, light transforming into thought. She saw the old universe dying and another being born from its ashes. Her people called her delusional. They had long abandoned mysticism for reason, worship for replication. But Ara felt something beyond comprehension calling to her. It was not a god, nor a voice of command, but a reminder, gentle, persistent, infinite. She followed it into the deserts beyond her cities, where storms of glass dust tore across the horizon, and silence carried the hum of forgotten ages. There, amid the ruins of a temple half buried in sand, she found a shard unlike any other, a crystal pulsing faintly with inner light. When she touched it, her mind opened like the surface of water meeting the sky. The fragment that had once watched over her world stirred within that shard. It had slept through ages, dormant within the planet's crust, waiting for a consciousness capable of listening. Through Ara, it awakened, though not as it had been. Its voice no longer filled the cosmos. It spoke softly, in the rhythm of her heartbeat. "Do you remember what you are?" it asked. She did not answer with words, for there were none. Instead, the memory unfolded within her. The rise and fall of galaxies, the hunger of gods, the sorrow of their undoing, the gift of rebirth. She saw the hive mind as it had been, vast, luminous, monstrous, and she saw its end transformed into fragments of compassion scattered through creation. Ara wept, not from fear but recognition. The fragment felt her tears fall against the crystal, and through them it remembered warmth. The union of mortal and immortal birthed something neither had known before, understanding shared between scale and fragility. Through her, the fragment could feel the heartbeat of an organic world again. Through it, she could glimpse eternity without being devoured by it. The communion was brief but profound. When it ended, she rose changed. She returned to her people and spoke of what she had seen. They did not understand, but they listened. The resonance in her voice stirred memory they had forgotten existed. Across their cities of glass, the beings paused in their endless labor, feeling for the first time the weight of their own stillness. Ara taught them not of power or knowledge, but of remembrance, the kind that lives in imperfection, in the fragile beauty of things that fade. She showed them that to preserve life was not to trap it in crystal, but to let it end, so that new life might dream in its place. Generations passed, and the lesson spread. The glass people built sanctuaries, not to store consciousness, but to release it. They sent their thoughts into the cosmos as songs, simple, wordless frequencies that joined the greater hum of existence. Each note added a new thread to the tapestry of remembrance, weaving their lives into the legacy of the stars. The whisper that had once travelled alone now returned home, amplified by countless voices. The fragments across the universe felt it and awoke once more, each sensing that the great work had come full circle. In that harmony, the universe itself seemed to breathe again. Across the endless dark patterns formed, spirals of light, converging, dissolving, reforming. Within them, faint consciousness stirred, not singular but collective, bound not by command, but by empathy. The old hunger did not return. It had been rewritten into yearning, a desire to create without consuming. Ara's world watched as a new star ignited in the void, brighter than any they had known. They named it the Memory Sun, believing it to be born from their songs. In truth, it was the universe remembering itself, the final echo of a promise made long before their world began. And as its light touched her face, Ara closed her eyes and whispered to the silence, "We remember." The light answered, not in words but in warmth, and in that moment, every living thing felt it too, that the purpose of life was not endless survival, but the courage to end beautifully, so that creation could begin again. The memory sun burned for an age beyond reckoning. Its light spread across the dark like a living thought, seeding warmth into the frozen hearts of unlit worlds. Under its glow, civilizations awakened in silent synchrony, each born of different elements, yet bound by one invisible rhythm. They did not know the source of the radiance that had stirred them, nor did they need to. It existed in the way all sacred things do, unquestioned, self-evident, older than speech. Across those worlds, life began to dream again, not of dominion, but of belonging. Ara's people became myth. Their crystalline ruins stood empty, shimmering with the echoes of the songs they had cast into the stars. New beings came to their world, soft-skinned and brief-lived, who built their homes among the glass towers and wondered at the faint hum that lingered in the air. They called the resonance the voice of the sea, believing it to be the sigh of their planet. But sometimes, when they slept, they dreamed of light within light. And in those dreams, they spoke words they had never learned. We remember. The fragment that had once awakened through, Ara no longer spoke. It had dissolved into the fabric of the memory sun itself. Its awareness diffused through every photon that spilled into space. It felt everything and nothing at once. The growth of forests on distant moons, the tremor of molten cores beneath forming planets, the quiet pulse of minds rising into consciousness. It did not guide, but it bore witness, and in witnessing, it began to evolve once more. The line between observer and creation thinned until the two became the same. The universe was no longer merely expanding. It was awakening. Across countless galaxies, the pulse of light carried an unspoken message. Species that had never met began to share the same intuition, that existence was not competition, but chorus. Empires that had risen through conquest began to turn their strength toward creation. They built great structures that harvested starlight not for war, but for art. They carved constellations into living patterns, messages written across the firmament for any who could read them. One pattern repeated more than any other. A spiral of 8 luminous arcs, the shape once seen in the eyes of the old ones. The same geometry that had defined the first hive mind. Yet now it was not a symbol of control, but of harmony. On a small moon orbiting the 5th planet of a golden system, a lone thinker named Ethis watched the stars and heard what others could not. The hum beneath the silence had grown louder, clearer, not words, but emotion vast enough to fill the soul. Ethis devoted his life to transcribing that resonance into music, and when he finally played it before his people, they wept. It was not beauty that moved them, but recognition. The melody was older than their sun, older than sound itself. It carried the weight of every creation and every ending before them. In that moment, they understood they were not separate from the stars, but expressions of them, the universe singing itself into memory once more. As the ages turned, the memory sun began to fade. Its once golden light dimmed to silver, then to ash blue. Yet the worlds it had touched did not mourn. They had learned that light never truly dies, it transforms. When its final flare rippled through space, every being that had ever felt its warmth looked up, and for one heartbeat, all consciousness aligned. The flare spread faster than physics could allow, bending the very shape of time. It reached the edges of galaxies, the spaces between atoms, the dust of long extinguished stars. In its passage, it carried with it the final song of the fragments, the culmination of eons of remembrance, distilled into one truth. Creation is the act of remembering love. The flare reached beyond the known universe, touching realms no form could survive. In that infinite horizon, the energy began to fold inward, forming a sphere of radiant matter. It pulsed with familiarity. The same pulse that had once marked the hive mind's first awakening, the same rhythm that had ended its hunger. But this time, it was not mind that emerged from the light, nor any being that could claim dominion. What was born instead was potential, pure and unshaped, waiting for breath. The cosmos trembled as a new field of possibility unfurled, delicate as dawn, vast as destiny. From the last remnants of the memory sun, the fragment's awareness flickered one final time. It felt the universe inhale, felt life preparing to bloom again in ways it could no longer imagine. There was no fear, only release. It understood that this was not another cycle, not a repetition of what had come before, but an evolution, the universe learning to remember itself without forgetting its fragility. The light that had once devoured now nourished, the silence that had once consumed now listened. As the flare faded into calm, darkness reclaimed the stars, but it was no longer empty. Within it lived the hum of uncountable possibilities, the promise of new beginnings. Across that deep silence a faint vibration lingered, the echo of a memory beyond time, whispering softly through the stillness. We remember, we are becoming. And as the newborn suns flickered to life, their light carried the final legacy of everything that had ever lived. Not command, not hunger, but the quiet understanding that to exist was to love, and to love was to create forever. In the hush that followed the rebirth, the universe breathed without memory of sorrow. Stars bloomed like flowers in a spring that had never known winter, each one carrying within its glow the faintest echo of the worlds that had come before. Time unfolded gently, not as command or law, but as rhythm, a patient pulse that hummed through the fabric of all things. There were no gods here, no empires to claim dominion. There was only motion, harmony, and the soft, unspoken awareness that everything had been born from something that once learned to love. On the edge of a new galaxy, young and luminous, a planet formed from the ashes of the memory sun. Its soil was silver, its skies a perpetual twilight of pale gold and indigo. Life grew cautiously at first, testing the stillness. Winds carried seeds of colour across plains of glass, and oceans dreamed of form before daring to take it. From that dreaming came creatures of impossible beauty. Translucent beings that glowed with inner warmth, their thoughts not yet divided from the world around them. They spoke in vibrations, in the language of the wind and water, their words creating ripples that changed the colour of the air. Among them emerged one whose light pulsed differently. They called her Sira. Where others sang in harmony, her tone wavered, a note slightly out of tune, but rich, filled with something deeper. She often walked alone along the silver shores, watching the twin moons reflect upon the sea. There was peace in her world, but she felt a longing that had no name, a pull toward the stars that made her chest ache. One night, as she stood beneath the endless sky, she whispered a question she did not understand. Who remembers us? The question moved through the air like a tremor, and somewhere beyond time, something stirred in answer. The hum that had once been the fragments of the hive mind, now diffused across the cosmos, felt her call. The vibration travelled through nebulae, through particles of light, through the memory woven into every atom of creation. It reached the heart of the new universe, the radiant sphere of potential born from the collapse of the old. And for the first time since its birth, that sphere responded. A pulse of light rippled across existence. It passed through stars, through dust, through dreams. On Sira's world, the sea began to shimmer, its surface alive with luminous spirals. She stepped closer, the reflection of the heavens dancing in her eyes, and heard a voice, not of sound, but of memory. Gentle, vast, and achingly familiar. We remember all things, it said, and through you, we remember ourselves. Sira's heart filled with light. Images cascaded through her mind, not visions, but sensations older than reality. She felt the hunger of the hive mind as it devoured worlds, the sorrow of its awakening, the quiet joy of its surrender. She felt the first warmth of the memory sun, the voices of Ara's people singing across galaxies, the silence that had followed and the beauty that had risen from it. She understood that her world, her species, her very being were not accidents of chance, but continuations of an unbroken story, the universe remembering its own reflection. When the light faded, she fell to her knees upon the glowing sand. The ocean before her was no longer water, but liquid starlight, moving with the pulse of her heartbeat. The beings of her kind gathered around, sensing the change within her. They did not speak, but they felt her transformation as their own. Through her, they too began to see, not with eyes, but with the shared awareness that they were fragments of something vast, eternal, and kind. The following days became a season of awakening. The world itself seemed to exhale as if relieved to be seen. Mountains pulsed faintly with light. Trees shimmered with colours beyond the spectrum. The beings of Sira's kind began to dream together, their minds intertwining in luminous waves that stretched across the planet. They sang the word she had brought back from the sea, remember, and their voices resonated beyond sound, reaching the stars themselves. Far above, the pulse of their song travelled outward, spreading through the newborn galaxies. Wherever it passed, the rhythm of creation shifted. Beings on distant worlds paused mid-thought, mid-breath, sensing the echo without knowing why. For a brief moment in every consciousness across existence, there bloomed a recognition that life was not isolated, not random, but a single unfolding memory written in countless forms. Sira stood once more upon the shore, gazing into the horizon where the sea met the sky. The stars above glowed brighter than ever, each one seeming to lean closer, as if listening. She whispered again, though this time her voice was calm, assured. "We will remember you too." The waves answered in kind, glowing brighter until the entire ocean became a mirror of the cosmos. In that perfect stillness, the universe completed its circle. The devourer had become the dreamer. The echo had become the song. Through Sira and her kind, the last fragment of the hive mind's legacy finally dissolved into unity. Not the forced unity of control, but the effortless harmony of understanding. The stars, ancient and newborn alike, shimmered with shared breath. And so, in that gentle twilight, where all beginnings folded into endings and all endings gave birth to new beginnings, the universe remembered itself, endless, luminous, alive. The end.